This episode is sponsored by Armis. Are your medical devices truly secure? Armis allows you to see, protect, and manage every device and asset in your environment, from the most common to the most complex across your health system, medical, IoT, or operational. Reduce risk, ensure compliance, and safeguard patient care with a trusted partner in cybersecurity. Don't leave your devices and your patients exposed. Visit thisweekhealth.com/Armis today to learn more.
Today on UnHack the News.
It's not from a lack of regulatory oversight or any of the other pieces and parts. This is just the brutality of where we see some of these attacks are going at this stage on what we're seeing. And seeing a loss of life associated with it is just alarming for anybody.
Hi, I'm Drex DeFord, a recovering healthcare CIO and longtime cyber advisor and strategist for some of the world's most innovative cybersecurity companies. Now I'm president of This Week Health's 229 Cyber and Risk community. And this is UnHack the News, a mostly plain English, mostly non-technical show covering the latest and most important security news stories. And now, this episode of UnHack the News. Hey everyone, I'm Drex and welcome to UnHack the News. We're going to talk about a bunch of stuff today, a couple of things today, and then we'll probably riff, which is what we do. Mick Coady's with me from Armis. For those of you who have heard us talk before, we have a tendency to go down rabbit holes and talk about other really important things, maybe other than the thing we started talking about. Mick, welcome to the show. I'm glad you're here.
Thank you for having me, Drex. Appreciate it as always.
Let's start with this story. This is from the Record, but I've seen it reported in other places too. A ransomware attack contributed to a patient's death, according to Britain's NHS. This has to do with the Synovus attack that happened last year, the blood distribution system, which then took down tons of hospitals across London and in the NHS. And the spokesperson here says that as a result of the attack, hospitals were unable to perform blood tests at normal speed. A number of contributing factors led to the patient's death during the incident. And then they say one patient died unexpectedly during the cyber attack. And they took detailed kind of notes and investigations to try to figure out really what happened and what was going on. But they directly attribute the cyber attack to the patient's death. We have a lot of these things that happen in the US too, from a cyber perspective. You've probably heard some stories like this too.
I have. I don't know if we have got one all the way to that end state yet. We've had close calls, right? As we know, maybe a couple of years ago, one particular system got targeted specifically on the EMR, where there were redirects, actual ambulatory redirects away from certain hospitals that could not take inbound patient, right? So it's highly unfortunate. I mean, I don't know. We're still awaiting kind of the expectations, the details of what happened with that. But yeah, when you have a loss of life, you probably know as much as I do, coming from where we both have come from, that nation state functions of what they've done in the utility grids, what they've done in specific other platforms. You look at the energy sector and oil and gas. There have been specific incidents where flow valves, other things have been overloaded, not overloaded, and loss of life can or could occur in those particular verticals, no different than we have in healthcare. But I mean, when you're not performing, you can't get specific types of, and maybe it's disease orientated that we're just delayed and you can't get those results back in time where you can provide triage to that function. It's a horrible thing to even talk about.
It is. We were talking earlier about a particular attack. I know there was one in Southern California where the health system was basically taken offline for an extended period of time. The challenge around that then really turned out to be, based on a study that was released later, not just that health system not being able to see patients, but because patients overflowed into other health systems, it impacted all the patients who were being seen in that health system. Like that big attack, that big challenge was something the whole community felt, not just that one organization.
Right. And that's why we brushed up against it. What was it, in 23 of Thanksgiving, just the day before Thanksgiving when that occurred? A good friend in a specific state that basically his wife was a nurse and basically the redirects were coming to that particular situation. The problem was there were 9 or 10 redirects. That system may or may not have been ready at their emergency,
they just don't have capacity, right? They wind up, now that emergency department is overwhelmed and delayed. They have to delay surgeries because they're taking patients from the health system.
And you would think blood testing because of the length of time it takes to do specific things, right? You would have had it, but the question in what condition was the patient in the first place, right? What were the preceding elements of comorbidities that got him to that point that the test needed to come back within an hour,
Yeah.
not 8 to 10 to 12 to 14 hours, which led to him or her passing. So it's very interesting kind of a situation. I hate to say when it happens. I don't know. The NHS has done a very good job in general and everything else. It's not from a lack of regulatory oversight or any of the other pieces and parts. This is just the brutality of where we see some of these attacks are going at this stage on what we're seeing. And seeing a loss of life associated with it is just alarming for anybody, right? And it's not for any particular reason, but we have got to start talking about this stuff, particularly at all levels. And I mean, globally, if that was that serious, where are our weaknesses? I mean, who would have ever thought just running blood tests would have led to loss of life? I think what happened in the United States in 23 would have been much more closely aligned because you people inside in ambulances and being redirected somewhere else. 30 minutes extra before they get to triage in an EMR could absolutely lead to a loss of life.
Yeah, that's what happens in a lot of the rural health cases where there's a cyber event at a rural hospital, and that's the only emergency room around for 100 miles. Now, I mean, literally, having grown up on a farm, I can tell you that the difference between my local emergency department and the one that was 75 miles away,
Yep.
when somebody was hurt or injured on a piece of farm equipment, probably meant the difference between life and death. I wonder how well we actually like keep track of this and report it, because the system isn't really built necessarily to report the death being attributable to a cyber event. There's some
Correct.
other thing that it's attributable to
In conjunction with, right?
in conjunction with, yeah.
Right. But you remember we used to talk about population health, right?
Mhm.
And the pop health kind of environments, as you look at how you would stage where you would do this, like you also now see the doc in the box type clinical type of things that have arrived. We've also now seen those evolve where they're built for 24/7 operation. So instead of a traditional 9 to 5 main hospital, right, you can, and I live out in the, I won't call it rural, but I'm definitely on the edges of outside of Houston where I live. And there's definitely more options there. But I would say if it's deemed, they will redirect you or send you to something more substantial. But I would tell you, growing up also in a very quote unquote rural environment in sections of Ireland, or my cousins also living in rural environments and all farmers themselves. In the old days, a GP happened to live across the street. That was great.
Right.
But it wasn't too long. I had my appendix out. The GP basically, I was put in an ambulance and I was sent straight into the city, right? That was not a short drive in those days.
Yeah. More and more of these very robust clinics that are opened up, but even they reach their limits. At some point, those
Sure.
patients have to go to an inpatient hospital, inpatient.
Well, they've improved though. They've got imaging available, which they never had before. They've got a rudimentary set of infusion pumps that can deliver some basic levels of hydration or whatever else they need to do. But most times that's just, you're getting pitched before you're getting into an ambulance somewhere else. So
I was looking at the HHS wall of shame. We're just talking about the HHS breach portal. That's what I actually should call it, because I think that's actually what it's called.
I wouldn't call it a shame. I think it's just a shame that we can't do enough, that people don't end up there. I don't think it's for a lack of trying. That's for sure.
I don't think so either. I mean, you and I both know the cyber pros, everyone that I've ever worked with are some of the hardest working people in the world. And it's not because they're not trying. They're doing everything possible. They're just kind of, in a lot of cases, they're just outmanned and outgunned and they just can't keep up. But I was looking to the breach portal because it's always interesting to just, I go out there and sort of tiptoe through the tulips every once in a while and see what's going on. There were 28 reported breaches. Now, reported breaches, it doesn't mean these happened in June. It just means they were reported in June. 28 reported breaches in June. And here we are on the 30th. So practically one a day was reported to the breach portal. And as I start to flip through and open these up, business associate present is a pretty significant number. It looks like maybe more than half as I go through them.
So we're going down the third party problem, right?
Sure.
Yeah, and it's kind of interesting looking at it from those perspectives of what we do to manage externally our partners, whether the conducting of how they come in to do basic maintenance. We talk about the vendors who support the infusion pumps, whether you rent, lease, buy, however, or any medical device for that matter, right? I mean, there's a huge market for that, but they also need to have access. But we've seen issues occur when they're just simply doing maintenance, right? And you're allowing yourself. But the third party risk thing, even back in the day when I was still serving in a Big Four situation, You're trying to amalgamate a workflow that makes sense. Some people started outsourcing that because it was such an overwhelming thing. So what is that business associate going to do now post breach? You get into the finger pointing game, right? And I would like to think that all parties would come together and find a meaningful way to resolve this. But if there's SLAs associated with it, it could get very ugly, right?
Yeah, very ugly, very quick. Well, anyway, thanks for going down that
No, that's fine.
rabbit hole with me. Here's another thing I wanted to ask you about. You guys have labs and you do a whole bunch of cool stuff. I was just looking at this, the 2025 Cyber Tractor Challenge. It's hosted by Iowa State University, and they bring students together from across the country to go test real world OT systems that are running in farm equipment like tractors. And you just, I mean, we're at that point. Everything's a computer. You guys must do a lot of the same kind of stuff in your labs, looking at stuff that people would roll their eyes and say, oh my gosh, I can't believe that's a computer.
Yeah, but you got to think about like, so I'm going back to the early 2000s. I think it was BMW, Mercedes. There was a myriad of the German auto manufacturers, including the American ones, who were starting to think about putting versions of what they would do with IBM, CA, different things of how they were taking inflow of identity sources via satellite to update firmware back in those days. Now, we're way past that, right? The cars are so much more advanced. Think about tractors, automation on what you're trying to do. The two of us now talking about agriculture, which is hilarious. But anyway, at the end of the day, I used to pick punnets and pick tomatoes and strawberries in a small rural town north of Dublin, and I know exactly what they were doing. But then you look at the sprayers, you look at everything else. Those are all run on electronic. I remember when I lived in Omaha for 5 years, there was a particular farmer who had almost 60,000 acres, and he could do everything via his phone. He was monitoring based upon what he was doing for the watering and everything else, and it was all done via SAT and everything else that ties into it. It's astonishing, right? So you can imagine if you can compromise a tractor or a combine harvester, what are we doing inside the hospital systems when it comes to imaging, fusion, all of the stuff that we have to deal.
Building systems too, right? I mean, cameras and everything else.
Man, I beat the hammer on that one quite a bit. And again, it goes back to some of the conversations we've had in the past, which is around operational risk. How do we determine when we talk to our business partners, chief medical information officer, surgery centers going up and down is not an acceptable thing. One, loss of revenue, but then also we just talked about patient safety, right? If those things are occurring, there's an air conditioning system required that runs all of those functions while you're sitting on the table, right? If any of that gets impacted, what happens? We both know from a bacterial perspective what can happen very quickly. Never mind in rural situations. Let's keep the agricultural rural thing. It's not uncommon in rural hospital situations or rural hospitals feeding into a bigger city that you have tuberculosis involvement, right? So the ventilation has specific HEPA requirements. You've got a whole litany of things. If that stuff fails and you have a patient who's a TB patient in those rooms, what do you do with them? Right? Where are you going to go with that person? That's massive chronic and very high level degree of impact to a patient and relative to death. So I find it interesting. I think you and I both would, from understanding at a rudimentary layer that people think about agriculture as something that could be impacted. Well, yeah, we just talked about patient safety at a different level. What would happen when you start breaking down the aspects of part of our food chain, supply chain breaking down?
Yeah, absolutely. The equipment in the kitchen, just right on down the line. It is amazing how many things too now have satellite Starlink or something embedded in them, and you may not even realize it when you buy it and install it. And you may have to go back and do some correction, especially if it's a third party that's maintaining it or running it. So
But I mean, too, like some of the recalls that are happening when it comes to FDA cited devices, I mean, no different. You'd have to go out to a farmyard for a section of whatever they're looking at. You'd have to go visit the device manually. You'll have to go do those updates manually. I mean, we take the car in, right? Some of these updates are happening. I mean, the first thing they do now, we've got the plug-in. It tells you everything with the car. We don't look inside the engine anymore. We're plugging something in that'll tell us what's happening, and the computer will feed back and say, nope, you got an issue with this fuse, you got an issue with this, you got an issue with this. Oh, by the way, your radio entertainment system needs a full firmware upgrade the next time you come in, right? It's completely dynamically changed on how we used to stick our hands inside the engine and go after what we'd ever want to fix, whether it was plugs or whatever we were doing, O-rings. It's very different. But at the end of the day, that's fine. I like the advancement. I think our quality of life has improved because of it. But then we also invite apertures of risk, right?
Yeah, for sure. Hey, thanks for doing this. I always appreciate it. It's always a good time to have the chat and wander around as we do.
Yes, we do.
I always learn something every time from you.
I appreciate that. Yeah, likewise. And if we can have the agricultural conversation, next time we're at a dinner somewhere, we have to up the game on what we were talking about, because I've been around different versions of farming, which we can talk about some other time. But thanks for taking and having me on. Really appreciate it. Cheers.
Of course, Mick Coady from Armis. Thanks for being here, and I'll see you on the road sometime soon.
Absolutely, you will. Cheers. Thanks so much.
Thanks for tuning in to UnHack the News. And while this show keeps you updated on the biggest stories, we also try to provide some context and even opinions on the latest developments. And now there's another way for you to stay ahead. Subscribe to our daily insights email. What you'll get is expertly curated health IT news straight to your inbox, ensuring you never miss a beat. Sign up at thisweekhealth.com/news. I'm your host, Rex DeFord. Thanks for spending some time with me today. And that's it for UnHack the News. As always, stay a little paranoid, and I'll see you around campus.